At some point, I hope they get it.
You're going to turn it over?
No, at some point, I might. But at some point, I hope they get it because it's a fantastic financial statement. It's a fantastic financial statement. And let's do that over. He's coughing in the middle of my answer.
Yeah, okay.
I don't like that, you know?
Your chief of staff.
If you're going to cough, please leave the room.
Mick Mulvaney's cough, the one heard round the world. Well, people in Donald Trump's orbit have apparently started calling that moment from the ABC interview Coughgate. That is according to Politico, as part of a new report that also suggests Trump may be tiring of his acting chief of staff, snapping at him with increasing frequency, expressing, quote, greater frustration than usual. If you feel like you've heard this story before, well, recall what happened to Mulvaney's predecessors, Reince Priebus and John Kelly, a slow deterioration between Trump and the person often charged with delivering bad news. The added wrinkle this time around, Mulvaney serves in an acting capacity as chief of staff. He is one of several key administration positions that either does not have a permanent designation or that remains unfilled. And you'll notice White House press secretary not listed there. That is because we learned today that Stephanie Grisham will take over for Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She will also step into the communication director position. That's a job that's been vacant since March, the same month we last saw a White House press briefing. Joining us now, White House bureau chief for the Washington Post, Phil Rucker. Phil, thank you for taking a few minutes with us. Reporting about Mick Mulvaney, is there anything to it?
Yeah, well, Steve, this is sort of a natural thing in Trump world, right? When aides are in these senior jobs where they're spending so many hours of the day interacting with the president eventually tires of them, gets sick of them, gets annoyed by them, doesn't want them around as much anymore. That doesn't mean necessarily that Mick Mulvaney is on his way out the door. Indeed, he could be on as the acting chief of staff or even a permanent chief of staff for many months to come. But it speaks to the president's sort of chaotic way of managing government. He is really his own chief of staff in many respects, and we saw various iterations in the John Kelly era where Kelly was in favor, then he was out of favor, and then he was in favor again, and the cycle just goes on.
So we put that list up, but again, all of those different positions within the administration that right now are being held on an acting or an interim, a non-permanent, often cases non-confirmed basis. Trump has talked about how he likes having people in these sort of acting interim capacities. What does Trump get out of that? Does that weaken his subordinates and give him more leeway? Is that what it is?
It absolutely does. It gives him the power to get rid of these people on a whim, and it makes the people in these acting positions feel less certain, less secure about their standing in the government, and therefore perhaps more likely to execute what the president wants, to not confront him and not challenge him. But what's missing right now is accountability. There's a reason that these permanent positions, not for the staff positions in the White House, but at the cabinet level, that they go through a Senate confirmation process so that there's an accountability measure with the Congress, which is a co-equal branch of government, and that is missing right now in a number of these positions.
The other news, Basil, today, a new White House press secretary, Stephanie Grisham. I guess the question that many people ask is, you have a new public face in a way. Traditionally, right, the press secretary is going to be the public face of the administration day to day, then the president will make sort of more grand pronouncements. But in this administration, Trump is the public face on everything.
He is, and to have a press secretary and communication, the head of communications, is actually really interesting. The question of whether or not we actually go back to some kind of daily or twice a week, some kind of regular press conference is going to be interesting. But yes, the president is the face and the sole voice of the administration. And to Philip's point, I think that's why this concept of accountability becomes so very important. Why even I, had a transition and changed my mind on this idea of impeachment, because there is nothing keeping this president accountable, not just for what he does through his bureaucracy, but what he does in terms of the bad behavior and speaking from the Oval Office about a lot of these allegations. So, that's really the concern that I have. It's this issue of accountability, and that work really isn't just getting done. And that's just a problem that Democrats are going to have to tackle, assuming we take back the office in 2020, to undo all of what he hasn't done.
Is that a message Democrats will try to run on to voters, talking about the way the administration is run, talking about interim versus permanent, or is that too much? Is that sort of too insidery and bureaucratic?
I hope not, for their sake.
It's actually remarkable, speaking about messaging, and both from the White House and outside of it. It's remarkable to me the ways in which the Democrats, especially members of Congress, have failed to capitalize on this president's missteps, mistakes, horrific behavior, the Mueller report. They really need a narrative to be pushed. They need to be on point, and they don't have the same talking points. Everyone's talking about something different. They don't have an alternate vision on immigration that's being pushed broadly. Some of the candidates do, but it's like the issues that Congress should be talking about, the Democrats specifically, are only being spoken about for some reason by the Democratic candidates. And listen, voters just went to the polls months ago. So I'm wondering why the Democrats are so silent on so many of these issues. And I think that's just a frustration of someone who watches, people who are good at messaging or not. And so we'll see how the new press secretary does.
Well, so Phil Rucker, just quickly, practical nuts and bolts question for you. A new press secretary comes in, position we were wondering who it was going to be. As a reporter covering this, how does that change your day-to-day working life?
Well, Steve, it really doesn't, actually. I mean, our job continues. We ask the same questions. We talk to the same, a different array of sources, but we're after the same information, and we're trying to hold public officials accountable. I mean, Stephanie Grisham will be a new figure in the West Wing, but she's not a new figure to those covering the White House. She was an early staffer on the Trump campaign. She, of course, was the spokeswoman for the First Lady's office, and so a lot of the reporters covering the White House, like myself, have known her for a long time now.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.